Hello, I'm Robert Hill, one of the trustees of the Land of Oak and Iron Trust. Welcome to the launch of our new edition of Thread of Iron, a book written by Douglas Berman and originally published in 2003. The book contains a definitive history of Shotley Bridge, Consett and District, with a particular reference to iron and steel making. The Land of Oak and Iron Trust is a registered charity. One of our aims is to advance education of the general public in the natural, industrial and cultural heritage of the Derwent Valley and surrounding areas, the area that we now call the Land of Oak and Iron. One of the ways we do this is by making available books that are difficult to find. Thread of Iron is such a book, and the third book that we have republished. We have 4 presentations in our launch event today. First, Douglas's son-in-law, Hayden Luke, will tell us about the author, Douglas Vernon. Local historian Dr. Helen Steadman, who has recently written a fact-based novel about the sword makers of Shotley Bridge, will be describing the contents of Thread of Iron. Next, Jeff Singleton and Andrew Thompson of Shotley Bridge Village Trust will explain the industrial history of the village. And finally, Alan Swinburne, who was employed at the works for many years until its closure, will be recounting some of his personal experiences and anecdotes, the ones that certainly don't find their way into the written history. Thread of Iron will be available to buy from the 12th of September 2020. Outlets selling the book are shown on the Land of Oak and Iron Trust website. You can also order copies of the book by contacting the Land of Oak and Iron Trust using orders@loit.org.uk. I will now hand over to Hayden to start our launch presentations.
Hello, I'm Hayden Luke, Douglas's son-in-law, and Robert has asked me to share with you some reflections on the man himself for the launch of the new edition of Thread of Iron, which is being republished by the Land of Oak and Iron. My first picture shows Douglas as most of his colleagues from the works will remember him, whether from the days of the old Consett Iron Company or later as part of the British Steel Corporation. It was taken in the 1960s as one of the furnaces was being tapped, at a time when his life was intimately tied up with those furnaces, which are the most fundamental process in iron and steel production. This was what he was watching. Douglas, or Dougie as most remember him, came to Consett in 1954 as assistant blast furnace manager. He retired in 1978 as manager production services. His devotion to Consett, Shotley Bridge and the local area, and to iron and steel were almost legendary. But what of his life before he came to Consett? The Thread of Iron leads back to another steel town, Sheffield. Born and bred in Sheffield, Douglas left school at 14, as so many did in those days, and began his working life as an apprentice with the Sheffield and District Gas Company. But, with war in the offing, in May 1939, he volunteered for the army and during World War II served with the Royal Engineers. 80 years ago, in September 1940, at the height of the Battle of Britain, came marriage to Marjorie Peach, also from Sheffield. A snatched few days honeymoon in Stocksbridge, then back to war service. Douglas quickly rose through the ranks, trained as a commando, was selected for officer training, and became a captain commanding a unit of sappers in the Mediterranean forces. His unit constructed the last Bailey Bridge built in Italy, and he proudly led his unit through Naples in the parade to mark Armistice Day in November 1945. After the war, Douglas returned to the steel industry, first at United Steel Companies Limited in Sheffield, then as trainee manager at Stewart's and Lloyd's in Corby. In 1954, in what was the defining move in his and the family's life, he came to the North East as assistant blast furnace manager for what was then the Consett Iron Company. It was here that he settled, in Shotley Bridge, with his wife and 2 daughters, Elaine and Diana, and very quickly developed his deep and abiding affection for the area, its people and its history. It was where he lived for the rest of his life. For Douglas, the family, and the people of the district more widely, the all-pervasive presence was the works. During his 24 years with CIC, then latterly BSC, Douglas fulfilled many different roles. He gained many professional awards and held a number of managerial posts, ending as manager, production services, when he retired in 1978. Douglas was always ready to give help, advice, and above all, encouragement for others. Such was the demand for his expertise that he was seconded for periods as a consultant overseeing the construction of blast furnaces at steelworks at Avilés in Spain and Durgapur, India. Durgapur Steel Plant is one of the integrated steel plants of the Steel Authority of India Limited, located in Durgapur, West Bengal. It was set up with the help of the United Kingdom, which is where Douglas came in. The plant, still functioning today, is 158 kilometres from Kolkata, on the banks of the Damodar River. Of that time, Douglas remembered particularly the pressure they were under to get the furnace up and running in time for the official inauguration by the President of India. They worked over Christmas, a situation not enjoyed by wife Marjorie and daughter Diana, who had accompanied Douglas to India. For much of his working life, Douglas taught City and Guild courses in iron and steel production in this building, the old Technical College, and elsewhere in the northeast. Whenever and wherever, he was always pleased to assist students with their projects on the iron and steel industry. Douglas was himself an example of someone who, from modest beginnings, because he really valued education, made the very most of his potential. Eventually, every working life comes to an end. This picture shows Douglas's retirement from the works in November 1978. We see the presentation of a bouquet to Marjorie by William Hume as Douglas at right looks on. Although Douglas was not still in post when BSC closed the works in September 1980, he remained proud of what had been achieved over the years and passionate about the qualities of the Consett workforce. He was determined to do all he could to help mitigate what had been a terrible blow for the town, and was pleased when he was appointed manager of the Derwent Side Industrial, Commercial and Horticultural Youth Training Scheme. Working from a converted house at 1 Hartington Street, he devoted his time and efforts over a 4-year period to assisting the young people of the district to obtain alternative employment. His strong commitment to education generally and to his own development led him to take an honours degree with the Open University. As a mature student, he really relished the opportunity to study subjects outside the technical sphere which had been the bread and butter of his professional life. These included music, for which he had a lifelong enthusiasm. For much of his life, he was a keen concert goer at the City Hall in Newcastle, and a long-time member of the Consett Gramophone Society. Douglas was active in the community in all sorts of ways. He was, for many years, a member of Consett Rotary Club, and, in 1992, was awarded a Paul Harris Fellowship, the highest Rotary International award. He served as a governor of Blackvine Secondary School, and in 2000, in the Millennium Honours, he was awarded the MBE for services to the community in Consett and Derwent Side. He and Marjorie were founder members of the Shotley Bridge Village Trust. It gave him particular satisfaction to help the Trust acquire, preserve and then renovate the pair of houses that are the War Memorial Cottages, and to see them return to their former glory. He was also instrumental in rescuing much historical material when the works closed, and over the years he also ensured that Beamish Museum received several significant pieces of industrial heritage from the works, including a steam crane, though he was cross that the curator took so long to put it on display. Such was his ability to communicate his passion, both for local history and for iron and steel, that he was much in demand for talks to local societies. The Shotley Bridge sword makers were a particular enthusiasm of his. In retirement, finally, he had time to devote himself to his great interest in local history, which ultimately led to the original 2003 publication of Thread of Iron. He had been gathering the material for many years, but retirement gave him the opportunity to pull it together and to write the book we celebrate today. Douglas would be delighted to know that local heritage is alive and well, and he would have been pleased and touched that the Land of Oak and Iron Heritage Organisation is republishing his book.
Hello, my name is Helen Steadman. I'm a historical novelist, So far I've written 2 books, Widdershins and Sunwise, about the Newcastle witch trials, although they are set in Shotley Bridge and Mutton Clog. My 3rd novel, The Running Wolf, is about the Shotley Bridge sword makers, and that comes out in November. I'd just like to say that I'm not lottery funded, by the way. It's the land of oak and iron that is, but you can always live in hope. 5 or 6 years ago, I started researching for my book, The Running Wolf, and I started to read lots of books about the sword makers, the history of the area, and 7 of the books are reviewed on my website. Many of these books are now out of print and hard to find, which can make them very expensive. If you want a copy from a library, worldcat.org will find a copy in the nearest library to you, which is quite useful. Robert Hill from the Land of Oak and Iron project read my review of Thread of Iron, and he thought it was an interesting book, so that has led to the reprint, which I think is brilliant because it's such a good resource for anybody interested in local history. Here's the first edition of Thread of Iron, which came out in 2003, or to give it its full name, Thread of Iron, A Definitive History of Shotley Bridge and Consett and District, Iron and Steel. I would say it's a book of 2 halves, and that'll be my only footballing reference, even though we are on our way to Wembley. The first part of the book covers from antiquity all the way up to 1839, and the second part moves from 1839 on to the 12th of September 40 years ago, which we all know very sadly was the day that Consett Steelworks closed its gate for the very last time. Chapter 1, Shotley Bridge. Douglas Vernon talks about the origins of the place name Shotley, saying it comes from Scots Lee, with Lee meaning clearing. He also offers an alternative, Pigeon Wood. He talks about the sources of the River Derwent, which fall from 2 springs 500 metres above Shotley Bridge. And while this isn't the actual source, Cauldron Snout in the North Pennines is nearby, and it does crash down about 500 metres. So I thought it would be useful to show this video. Chapter 2, Roman Times. This area is really rich in Roman heritage, and we're not a million miles away from the Roman wall. I was particularly interested in this plaque of a Roman smith, which was found at Corbridge, which is a nearby area with a lot of Roman heritage. And Vernon says this is the Celtic god of smithing, Govannon. And I was also amused by the picture of a pair of blacksmithing tongs, which are almost 2,000 years old, because they looked exactly like the tongs I used when I did my blacksmith training when I made a sword. So despite all of the advances in technology, some things don't change very much at all. Chapters 3 to 4, the Dark and Middle Ages. There's quite a lot of religion in this section, with black monks, white monks, the women at Ebchester, the anchorites, until the arrival of the Danes, when bang went the monasteries. And it was quite fascinating to learn about the protection racket that the Danes set up, whereby they made local people pay something called Dane Gelt, which I think is quite self-explanatory. But the most intriguing part for me was the origin of the name Consett, which I'm not sure how to pronounce it, but I'll give it a shot. Konchved, which means coney's head, rabbit's head. And I thought it was fascinating that the hills of Consett and surrounding areas would be the rabbit ears, and perhaps the rest of the rabbit, this sort of rabbit made of iron, lead, and silver, was buried still underground. So my imagination went into overdrive, and I did a bit of writing about that, although it hasn't seen the light of day yet. Chapter 6 to 11, 16th century to 19th century. The area was so sparsely populated, we didn't even warrant a mention in the Domesday Book, but despite that, there's quite a lot of activity going on. For example, the Benfield Side 2, who sound like they should be in a modern-day tabloid newspaper, were actually a pair who tried to reinstate Mary Queen of Scots and were hanged for the trouble. Somebody else who was hanged was Ralph Mad Madison, who was perhaps the nearest thing we had to a serial killer in those days. He killed at least 2 men and had to go at least 1 other, possibly more. Robert Witch Wilson who wasn't actually a witch, but an engraver and somebody who was good at healing, and as far as I know wasn't hanged or punished for witchcraft in any way, shape or form. And of course it's the period when the sword makers arrive, and here I am, also a sword maker, with the sword I made back in 2018 as part of my research. Chapter 12 to 22, the works. Vernon talks about the resources in the area, so the excellent coke and coal, but also the poor quality black band ironstone, which wasn't really suitable without a lot of purification work. He talks about the lifetime of the works, ranging from Derwent Iron Company through to British Steel Corporation when it closed 40 years ago today. As well as the 10 chapters, there's also a lot of appendices, and they contain background information, charts, tables, facts, figures, news snippets. And there's also a huge amount of information about the people of Consett's fight to keep the steelworks open. So for anybody interested in steelwork and in this area, or indeed the rest of the country, this is a brilliant resource for you. Here is the second edition of Thread of Iron by Douglas Vernon. It's an excellent book. It's packed with historical fact, and I think you go a long way to find a more informative book about local history. And Douglas Vernon must have done a phenomenal amount of work, and his family must be really proud of his achievement. Thank you very much for listening.
Andrew and I are proud to be involved with the relaunch of Doug Vernon's book, as he was a founding member and the first chairman of the Shotley Bridge Village Community Trust in 1972. Our short presentation is about the industrial past of Shotley Bridge. This is one of the earliest paintings of the Shotley Bridge Village Centre, based on a wood engraving around 1840. 4 industries have had the most impact on the development of the village. Sword making was the first endeavour in 1687, followed by paper making in 1771. Flour milling began in 1840, and the gasworks started production in 1856.
The swordmakers of Shotley Bridge have become part of County Durham history. The story of 19 families leaving their homes in Solingen, Prussia, to travel to the northeast of England to make swords for the King and the English army in the 1680s seems far-fetched, but it is true, and the skills were sorely needed. Commenced in 1685 by a group of London and Newcastle businessmen, a sword-making facility was set up in Shotley Bridge. They initially employed Johannes Dell, Peter Henkels and Heinrich Hopp from Hounslow to make swords. By 1687, the 19 families had arrived from Solingen, led by Adam Oley and Herman Mole, to increase sword making. On the 15th of September 1691, King William III granted a royal charter to the Hollow Sword Blade Company to make the much prized short sword with the hollow blade. The sword makers went on to manufacture broadswords, rapiers, hangers, cutlasses, bayonets and dirks, bearing the mark of the flying fox or running wolf. Manufacturing levels were very dependent on demand due to wars. One record indicates that 19,200 blades were manufactured over a 557-day period around the 1709-1710 mark. Certainly there were peaks and troughs in the business, but one such peak in 1787 meant that a new Cutler's Hall could be built as a home for William and Anne Oley. By 1840, demand for swords had reduced and the final sword mill was closed, being converted into a flour mill. This was the same year as the Derwent Iron Company was formed.
Although cutting millstones from the River Derwent is mentioned in 1399, it was not until the Hatfield Survey of 1437 that the first ancient corn mill in Shotley Bridge was documented. Apart from corn and sword mills, the River Derwent provided power and water for paper mills at Shotley Grove, which were redeveloped in 1826 by John Annandale. In 1840, this entrepreneur re-established a flour mill on the site of the last sword mill in Wood Street. His son Andrew took over the mill in 1861 and employed 4 millers, a boy assistant and 4 cartmen. In December 1872, Andrew Annandale sold the flour mill to the newly formed Derwent Flour Mill Society Limited. Over the next 60 years, the federation of 6 local cooperative societies that own the mill invested heavily in new buildings, steam power and modern machinery. But in 1933 the mill was closed, with all milling transferred downriver to Dunstan so as to achieve even more economies of scale. These photos show the flour mill in the year of its jubilee, 1922. For many years the site was used by a building contractor and then stood derelict until a local developer obtained planning permission for housing development in 2002. Everything was demolished apart from the mill office, which was converted into Mill Race Cottage. Today, from the bridge, a block of flats can be seen, matching the mass of the original Riverside Mill building.
Paper manufacture began at Elands when Cuthbert Smith owned the mills in the 1760s. In 1812, John Annandale bought the mills at Elands, renaming them Shotley Grove, and within a year had increased paper production from 4 to 6 tons per week. In 1826, Shotley Grove House was built as the Annandales' home, and descendants lived there until 1945. To increase production further, in 1828 the Low Mill was built. John Annandale died suddenly in 1834, but he left the management of his company to his widow, 6 sons and 2 daughters. In the 1850s, introduction of steam power and Fordrinia's continuous paper-making machine increased production in product types. Cartridge paper was made for Her Majesty's Stationery Office. In 1881, the works was running 24 hours a day, producing 40 to 50 tons of paper per week, using esparto, grass and furnished rags as raw product, employing 300 local people. By 1894, production had increased to 95 tons per week, with further investment in machinery. It was one of the largest manufacturers in the country, and in 1896 a decision was taken to make the business a limited company. Then suddenly in 1906, employees were given 14 days' notice to terminate their roles. The business closed. Cheap imports and new production methods meant it was no longer viable. In 1951, the final 120-foot chimney erected in 1834 was felled, leaving only the workers' cottages and Shotley Grove House as a reminder of the once great industry.
The Shotley Bridge and Consett District Gas Company was formed at a meeting in the Mechanics Institute, Shotley Bridge, in June 1856. At this meeting, leading businessmen in Shotley Bridge were elected to the committee. Thomas Wilson of Shotley Hall and Peter Annandale of Shotley Grove were elected trustees, with Martin Bell, a teacher at Shotley Grove School, appointed secretary. The erection of the gasworks was completed in December 1856, and gas was first supplied to the district just in time for Christmas. In 1888, the company's offices were moved from the works at Green Street to new offices on Front Street. Then in 1937, the head office and showrooms were transferred to modern premises in Consett. Following the nationalisation of the gas industry, by the Gas Act of 1948, the company was transferred to the Northern Gas Board in May 1949. The development of natural gas production and supply meant that the production of gas in works like Shotley Bridge was destined to end. The production of gas at the Shotley Bridge works had continued for almost 100 years when the gas-making plant was shut down in November 1954. The photos show the gasworks looking down from the A694 and at the northern end of Wood Street. Following the closure of the works in 1969, the site remained derelict until 1988. It was then reclaimed prior to redevelopment for housing and named Oley Meadows.
If you'd like to know more about the history of Shotley Bridge, there is a 32-page booklet available on the history of the village. It's available at the Winlayton Mill Visitor Centre and also online at shotleybridgevillage.trust.com. If you're interested in the village trust, which Douglas Vernon helped set up, you can also get information about how to join at the same website. Thank you.
Good afternoon. I'm Alan Swinburne. I worked at the steelworks from leaving school in 1963 to closure in 1980. I hadn't had any intention of going to the steelworks for a job. I was passionate about farming and hoping I was going to follow in my father's footsteps, who had been a farmer all his life. But he thought differently, and he sent me to the steelworks to find a proper job. Luckily, I'd been interested in the science subjects at school, and I got an interview in the technical research department. It was a culture shock walking from a farming environment into the industrial site of Consett Iron Company. Also, the interview was very memorable. I was interviewed by Dr. Stan Cope, who was chief metallurgist of the steelworks. The training program consisted of a 5-year program. The first 3 years, you study for 1 day and 1 night at Consett Technical College. And if you passed the exams, and only if you passed the exams, you went on to study 1 day a week at Rutherford College in Newcastle. In conjunction with this, you were sent round the departments for a period of 9 to 12 months. My first secondment was at Tempertown Brickworks. And if I thought it was a shock walking into the steel plant for the interview, it was a real eye-opener when I went to work at Tempertown. They were fantastic people and great colleagues, but they did have strange ways of teaching you lessons of life. The first thing I was involved with was the development of a light, strong brick. And after several discussions and meetings, it was decided the best way to make one was to mix Rice Krispies in with a refractory material, with the theory that when they fired the brick, the Rice Krispies would burn out and form an aero-type bar. After several more discussions and other ideas, it was decided to make this mix. We made the mix and produced some bricks, which of course had to dry out overnight before we could fire them. So we left them on the shop floor, and the next morning an entourage of managers and those interested in the development of this brick went over to fire them. When we got there was just several piles of refractory material on the shop floor. The pigeons had had the Rice Krispies out the bricks. As far as I can remember, that was the end of that research program. Most of the managers were hard on you, but they were very, very fair. And one Wednesday night, instead of going to college, I decided I would play in a table tennis semi-final competition. The next morning, when I was going into work, before I even got my coat off, I was summoned into the chief chemist's office. The technical college had been on the phone early in the morning, informing him I hadn't been to college the night before. I was given a big dressing down, asked why I hadn't been to college, and I told the truth. I'd been playing in a table tennis competition. I was then lectured on how important it was to learn metallurgy and not table tennis, and told if it happened again, there would be grave consequences. I was then sent out of the office, and as I went out, the chief chemist asked us how we came on, and I said, "Oh, we won." He said, "Oh, congratulations. I just hope the final's not on a Wednesday night." And that's the way they treat you. You had your dressing down, it was forgotten about, and you got on with your work, and it was never mentioned again. Also, along all the good, great things that we learned at the company was respect. In the early 70s, I was sent from the foundry to work in the plate mill, and I wasn't too happy about it. I loved the foundry and wanted to stay there. So when I went to the plate mill, I was a little rebellious, had a chip on my shoulder, and I was Jack the lad, thought I knew it all. And in the early days, I was sent out to the shop floor to find a foreman called Chick Patterson, who had to find some plates for me to inspect. So I went to the plate mill, and anybody who knew the plate mill knows it had an elevated walkway down the centre. So I walked down there and saw Chick on the ground floor, and I just shouted down at him, "Chick, Chick," and I got no response. I repeated my request and still got no response. So I went back up to my boss and I said he won't take any notice of us. And the boss asked what happened. I told him what happened. He says, no, son. You go down and you stand next to him. And when he acknowledges you there, you address him as Mr. Patterson. So I went back down, did as my boss had said, and Mr. Patterson, could you please find these plates for me? Which he did, no problem, and laid them out on the floor for me to inspect. I worked alongside this foreman for several months, but for the first few weeks I was told I'd call him Mr. Patterson. And after that, he said, oh, you can call this Chick now. And that was how you taught respect. You gained respect, and once you'd gained it, I had a fantastic time working in the plate mill. With several other incidents and several other characters that I met. And one of those was Jackie Herdman. Everybody knew Jackie, War Jackie. He was a farmer from Epps Green, but also an industrial chemist. And in between doing all his jobs, he used to tour the steelworks, selling eggs, chickens, and turkeys at Christmas. He also couldn't get his car from Epps Green to Consett in the winter. So he came to work on his horse, and there is a slide in the collection showing Jackie on his horse at the steelworks. He used to ride his horse, tied up in the power station, feed and water it, and then ride home on a night. So although the steelworks produced great steel, and it was a hard work at time, there was always enjoyment in every department. And also, there was a fantastic social life. Every sport was played between the departments, and of course the big sport was football. And if you won the inter-department football trophy, it was like winning the FA Cup. And the TRD did it on one occasion when I worked there. And we celebrated so well in Bottles after winning the cup. One of the managers had to take the trophy home because none of the players were capable of carrying it out the nightclub. But we worked hard and we played hard. And I was taught given all the confidence, authority, and knowledge. So when Steelworks closed in 1980, I was able to start my own business along with a colleague, connected with steel, engineering, shipbuilding, and oil work. It was so successful, I retired at 53-year-old 20 years ago. So I've got a lot of people to thank at the Steelworks for pointing me in the right direction, putting an arm around it when I needed it, and helping me to carve out a successful career both before and after 1980. I always look at the advert for the Navy, and I say I was born in Bridge Hill, but I was made at Consett Iron Company. And after my retirement, I have given several talks to groups of school children, societies, organisations, trying to pass on the knowledge I have of Consett Iron Company and explain to those people who were too young to remember the steelworks or moved into the area after the closure of the steelworks, why Consett is there. And there's on several occasions I've been asked questions which I didn't know about, facts and figures. And I've always referred to the book Thread of Iron. And I've got some great information out of it, which I've been able to pass on to people who have asked the questions. One of the other things that you were taught at the Steelworks was to have confidence and feel comfortable in the presence of senior members of staff, even from a young age. On one occasion, I'd done a small cost-saving report on the repair of ingot molds at the foundry. And I was sent with this report to the general officers to see Bill Hume. Now, Bill Hume was one of the top bosses at the company, and he had an office on the second floor of the office block. I'd never been in the office block before, and let alone upstairs. I was terrified when I went over to see him. So I went over, climbed up the stairs, and gently knocked on his secretary's door. I gave it 2 gentle taps. No answer. These doors were about 3-inch thick oak. And I went back to the foundry and told my boss he wasn't in. Of course, the boss picked the phone up, contacted his secretary, and she confirmed that Bill Hume was in. So I went back again, I was sent back again, and this time knocked on the door. I was beckoned in and shown into Bill Hume's office, sat behind a massive desk at the end of this big office. So I sat myself down and presented the report. He went through it and put it to one side and he says, "Thank you, I'll be in touch." And I went back to the foundry and my boss said to us, "What was the matter? Why didn't you go the first time?" I says, "I was frightened, I was overawed, I didn't want to go in." And he said to me, he said, "You know, Bill Hume was once a young 20-odd-year-old, and he must have been nervous when he had to talk to his superiors. But he is a human being after all." The report was implemented and it saved the company some money. And a couple of years later, Bill Hume was secretary of the Consett Iron Company rickshaw, and I was on the committee. And after a meeting one night, we had some refreshments afterwards, and Bill come over to us, and he said to us, "Oh, you still enjoying working at the foundry?" I said, "Well, no, I've moved on now." But he remembered me from a couple of years earlier for one small report, and that really gave you confidence to be comfortable in the presence of people like Bill Hume. Thank you.